はい、それでは本日最後のプログラム、内外コミュニティ紹介を始めたいと思います。まずはじめに、チャド・ファウラーとリッチ・キューマーから Ruby セントラルの紹介があり、その後、国内各地の Ruby コミュニティについて高橋さんが紹介します。それでは進行は高橋さんです。
それでは、始めさせていただきます。内外コミュニティの紹介ということで、まずは最初に海外コミュニティということで、Ruby セントラルの、リッチ・キルマーとチャド・ファウラーに来ていただきました。で、皆様よろしくお願いします。で、最初にちょっと、ご紹介いたします。Ruby セントラル、皆さんご存知でしょうか。まあ、以前からある団体で、基本的には、行っている活動としては、Ruby カンファレンスの主催ですとか、レイズカンファレンスの主催などを行っている、団体になっています。で、名前としては、デイビー・ラックと、あとシャート・ファウラー、リッチ・キルマーの3名が、中心になって動いていまして、で、今日は、デイビー・ラックの方がちょっと来れなかったので、シャート・ファウラーとリッチ・キルマーの2人に、来ていただいております。で、あと、インフォイーサー、リッチとシャドウの2人は、インフォイーサーという会社に今、所属しておりまして、で、Ruby セントラルに比べますと、インフォイーサーの方は、もしかしたら馴染みのない方がいらっしゃるかと思うんですけれど、インフォイーサーは、もともと、Ruby 工事の、管理の方をされていた会社です。で、現状は Ruby 工事の方も、Ruby セントラルの方に移られていると、Ruby セントラルの方で管理されているというふうな話だそうです。で、まあそんな感じの、お二人に来ていただいております。で、まあ、海外ゲストということもあるので、翻訳の方、IRC の方で行うことになっております。で、プロデューサーの方では、IRC の方が表示されますので、そちらの方も、合わせてご覧ください。というわけで、改めまして、ご紹介いたします。じゃあ、手前、左から、リッチ・キルマーさんです。で、向かって右手の方、シャドウ・ファウラーさんです。その後ろの方に、通訳として来ていただいております、レオさんです。で、まあ、国内側の事情に詳しいということで、松本さんの方にも来ていただいております。松本幸宏さんです。そして、司会進行の方は、また、私の方、高橋で、告知させていただきます。よろしくお願いいたします。で、まず最初にですね、お二人、リッチとシャドウのお二人が、Ruby を使い始めているのは、まだ、20世紀の頃ですね。違うか。まあ、でもその頃で、まだ、2000年代になってない頃の、昔から使われています。で、まあ、その頃は、まだ Ruby の知名度というのは非常に低くて、で、まあ、海外ではほとんど知られてないに等しいというふうな状況で、まあ、お二人が Ruby に関わった、Ruby と知ったきっかけといったところから、お二人に、お話しいただきたいと思います。
I came to Ruby through Smalltalk. I had a plan to first learn Python, and I learned a lot of Python and used Python for maybe 1 year, and it always seemed philosophically good, but practically uncomfortable. So one day I had decided to give up on Python and to switch to Ruby. Switch to Smalltalk. I decided this on a Friday, and Saturday morning I woke up and I found Ruby on the internet, and I rewrote my entire website using Ruby with ERB, written by Satan. And I never learned Smalltalk.
Thank you. I wrote about 600,000 lines of Java code in a startup. And so I was a very early Java user, starting in 1995. So we were in the Alpha 2 version of Java. We learned Java very early. And around 2000, I had my own company then. Around 2000, I was looking at different languages other than Java that were easier to integrate with native code, because Java was so difficult to integrate with native code. And so I started learning different languages, TCL, some Perl, quickly ran away from that. Then I learned Python, and I started doing Python for about 6 months. And I was always uncomfortable with the fact that Python made me look at the inside of objects all the time. It was almost like seeing your guts with self. It was just, it felt wrong. Then the Pickaxe book came out. And I sat down one Friday night and read the entire book. I couldn't put it down. It was like the best novel I'd ever read. And I was so happy. I never even touched the computer to type in any of what was in the book. I just, at that point, believed that Ruby was the language I wanted to use and never wanted to touch Java or any other language again. And so that was early 2001. My company went out of business that I was in, and so I decided that it would be a great time to just focus on Ruby all the time. And I have not coded Java since then. And been coding Ruby since then, actually, for pay, which is good, since 2001.
というお二人なんですが、で、海外の方では、2001年に、Ruby カンファレンスというのが、開催されています。ちょうど、この T シャツが Ruby カンファレンスの時に配られた T シャツで、感想の中から発して持ってきたんですが、でその時に、主催として、2人が、関わっていたかと思います。で、なんでその Ruby カンファレンス、その実際にRuby を使われて気に入られてというので、そこからこう Ruby カンファレンスの開催に至るまでの、経緯を教えていただければと思って、お答えいただけますでしょうか。
In 2001, early 2001, a guy named Guy Hurst actually started the plan for RubyConf. And there were many of us very excited about this plan, but the economic downturn caused Guy Hurst to not be able to follow through with RubyConf. So in, I think, August of that year, he announced that he would have to cancel RubyConf. And Dave Thomas talked to David Black and I on IRC and said, we have to make this happen. We have to do RubyConf. So you two should help. And then David Black and I basically took over RubyConf, and Dave Thomas just encouraged us to continue doing it. The first Ruby conference we had 34 people, I think, 34, and Matsumoto-san came and gave the keynote, as he has done almost every year since. We had Ron Jeffries, Jim Hendrickson, Brian Barrett, Dave Thomas, Andy Hunt, all of these people who were also very involved in the Agile software community, extreme programming community. And it was right after they had written the Agile Manifesto. So there was a great synergy, a combination of two worlds, Agile world and this new Ruby world. And we came together for 3 days right before Huxla conference in Tampa, Florida. And it was the most exciting computer experience of my career. Maybe even since then. It was probably the best conference that I had ever been to, and still have ever been to. So that excited us to continue and to do it every year since. And now we have, last year, 550 people. And only because we limit the size of the attendance.
松本さんの方にも聞いてみたいんですが、松本さんの方に、最初に Ruby カンファレンスの話があったのは、これいつ頃どういうふうな形であったのかって覚えてます
か？日本語で、いや日本語で、あんまり覚えてないんだけど、確か2001年のウプスラちょっと話してくれたんだけど、オプスラっていうのは、ACM っていうアメリカの、日本世界で一番大きいコンピューター学学会の、オブジェクト思考に関するカンファレンスで、毎年どっかで開かれてるんですけども、持ち回りで開かれてるんですけど、その年はちょうど、フロリダで開かれて、その、ちょうど前の週に、カンファレンスをするからっていうメールを、多分デイビッド・ブラックからもらったと思うんですね。でその年は面倒くさいとして炭疽菌がすごいちょうどフロリダで流行ってるので、お前この時にこのタイミングでフロリダに行くかとかですね、死ぬ気かとかみんなに言われてですね、まあそれはそれとか言って、まあ言って言ったのがで、その後ウプスラの方からもちょうど同じ年に呼ばれて、それはダイナミックランゲージのパネルがあるっていうんで、パネリストとして呼ばれてたので、で、マルビーカンファレンスに出て、ウプスラに出て、帰ってくるっていうふうに出かけました。あの時日本人は高橋さんと僕と、青木さんもいたよね。3人いますぐらいですね。高橋さんよく行ったよね、青木さんだけど。頑張ったね。あの時は僕は関空から出たんですけれども、関空でカバン全部開けされて、テロリストに出たんだろうか、大変な時期でした。すみません。
ありがとうございます。もともとその Ruby カンファレンスの方のサポートで、をされてて、でその後そのカンファレンスのサポートをする団体として、Ruby セントラルの方ができたかと思うんですけど、その Ruby セントラルができた経緯というのも教えていただきますか。
The first Ruby conference was organized by just David Black and myself and Dave Thomas, and that was okay. The second Ruby conference was just me and David Black, and we did it in Seattle. And conferences cost money, and that year we actually lost money. So it's never been something that we profit from. So we lost money, which meant that David Black and I had to give money to have RubyConf. And we realized that there were many reasons, legally and financially, that we should create an organization. And also in the United States, many of the other open source communities have nonprofit organizations under which to do work. And so we decided to start Ruby Central as an official nonprofit organization to support conferences and then other possible things with the language. So far, we mostly have only done conferences, but we plan to expand that. So that's why we started Ruby Central.
Ruby セントラルでは、Ruby カンファレンス以外に、レイスカンファレンスの方も、行っていますし、あとそれ以外のリージョナルカンファレンスの方の、サポートも行っていると聞いています。で、実はそっちの方は私は行ったことないのでよくわからないんですけど、その辺の、Ruby カンファレンスとあとそれ以外のカンファレンスに関して、違い等があれば教えていただけますでしょうか。
Okay, I joined Ruby Central in 2003. Yeah, 2003. They asked me to join Ruby Central as well. And it was only RubyConf, I guess up until 2006, when we added a Rails conference. And the reason we did that is the Ruby conferences grew so quickly. From one year we had about 50 to 60 people, and the next year had 350 people. And we knew that it was going to grow from there. And the reason it was growing was the incredible growth of Rails and of people using Ruby because of Rails, that we realized that we should probably do a separate conference that focused on Rails. So we did the first Rails conference. The first Rails conference was 700 people. And we were amazed. We partnered with another company to do that, to put on the conference, to help us with the logistics of the conference, because it's very challenging not only to pick the different speakers at a conference, but also then to actually run the conference. We chose another company to do that. And that again helped that we were a nonprofit, that we could do that. Then we partnered with O'Reilly and Associates to do not only a Rails conference that next spring, but then a corresponding European Rails conference in the fall. And at this point, we're going to be doing that at least for the next 5 years. But then Ruby conference we continue to do just with Ruby Central. So we manage that ourselves. And so these Rails conferences, the last one that we did had 1,800 attendees. And so we went from 700 to, I believe, 1,600 to 1,800 attendees in each of those years. And then in Europe, we did about 500 to 600, I believe, in Europe. 750, sorry, last year. And probably we'll do about the same this year. So it's amazing that the first, or last, I think it was last year's Ruby conference sold out in, I believe, 3 hours. And that was 500 seats. So if you weren't online at that time, you weren't going to get a ticket. But those conferences, as they came together, it's just been a positive experience every single conference. We've really not had, there's stress involved, mostly on Chad, which is good. That it's not on me, not that it's on Chad at all, but it's good that, we've really enjoyed each of the conferences we've had.
One major reason that we made the Rails conference is in 2005 at the Ruby conference, we had gone from 64 people to 200 people. And we noticed at the conference that there were two communities. There were the original Rubyists, and then there were these Rails people. And they didn't mix well. The Rails people wanted to talk about the web and making money, and all of these things that Rubyists weren't traditionally interested in talking about. So part of why we created RailsConf is so that the Rails people could go and talk about things that made sense in their culture, and the Ruby community could still have a pure, very nerdy Ruby conference.
先ほどの、話も、あるんですが、1の方では、インフルエンサー、会社の方でも、Ruby を使って、やっていると。で、先ほど、国内の方でも、Ruby のビジネスの利用という話もあったんですが、海外の方というか、インフルエンサーを中心としてになるかもしれませんけれど、そちらの方のRuby のビジネスの利用についても、一言。
Well, I started InfoEther in that spring of 2001. By starting it, I incorporated. I had no business other than a name and Ruby. And I actually formed the company with someone that I knew from before, who was a business partner that I'd worked with before. And actually, it was at the Ruby conference in the fall, that first Ruby conference, that I actually got the call that I had put in a proposal to work on a project for the Defense Department. the U.S. Defense Department. InfoEther was founded in Virginia, Northern Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C. And we ended up putting in a proposal to replace, or to build a testing framework for a very big Java application. And we proposed using Ruby for that. And so this was in the fall of 2001, and I got notified actually at the conference that they were going to accept that. So starting in early 2002, we got on a 3-year project where we did nothing but write Ruby code to support this project. And it was a very large Ruby project. And since then, our company has been only writing Ruby code and getting paid for it in the United States. We started with 4 people and have now grown to 7. Chad Fowler, Marcel Molina, who's here as well as Tom Copeland, who runs RubyForge. We started RubyForge out of that same government project we were working on. We put it in my basement, and we ran RubyForge there for 3 years. And I had 3 DSL lines coming into my basement to run RubyForge. I kept adding them as we got more and more popular, until we eventually needed to move it out of my basement because my wife didn't like the sound that was coming from the basement. It was very loud down there. And we moved it to a co-location facility. InfoEther ran RubyForge and funded it. We also sponsored, we're I think the first sponsors for a dinner at Ruby Conference in Virginia. So we were the first corporate sponsor for a Ruby event. But we really believed that these things gave back to a community that was benefiting us as a company. And so we wanted to give back as much as we could. And so these were just ways that we could give back. And we continue to do that in whatever efforts we do. Ruby Central has taken over the running of RubyForge. It's still a very good community resource for Ruby projects. But in the United States especially, I mean, that's the area I know mostly. Because of Rails, again, Ruby has become very popular. Most investors now, venture capitalists, as they're investing in companies, actually wonder why you're not doing Rails if they're going to invest in you. They actually will ask the question if somebody's using something else. Like, why use this Django Python thing? You should be using Rails. So these are investors saying these things to startups. So there's a now growing awareness in both the investment community and in the business community. And I think it's starting to get into the more traditional corporate communities inside the United States, and I believe also in Europe. There's been a big uptake in the business community. In RailsConf last year in Europe, there was a large number of businesses, startups that were doing things, and also traditional larger businesses that were doing things with Ruby and Rails. And so we see it as a rapidly growing segment of business. The Rails community is very pro-business and making money with Ruby and Rails. And I think what's nice is the more people learn about Rails, the more they need to learn Ruby, and the more that's branching out. And really, RubyConf has become more a core Ruby knowledge conference. This is where you go to really learn and understand Ruby as you grow. So it's kind of nice. Actually, I know very little, I don't hear much of what happens in the business side in Japan. So that's actually something that's interesting. One of the reasons we wanted to come to this conference was to be able to learn more about how Ruby has affected businesses here, and to see, to understand the community in Japan, because it feels, although from a code perspective we share, it feels that we don't have a good amount of knowledge transfer about business and how and what we're doing with this language and these tools.
松本さんの方から見て、そういう海外の活動で、ディセントラルの方の活動に関しては、松本さんは直接コメントされてないですよね。で、でも松本さんのコメントしてないところで、次のコミュニティが立ち上がって活動が行っているということに関して、感想というか、
Ruby セントラルについては、もともとRuby カンファレンスをスポンサーするために生まれた組織ということもあって、私自身は全然タッチしていないんですけれども、で、最近では Ruby セントラル非常に成長してですね、例えば、リージョナル Ruby カンファレンス、地域 Ruby カンフですね、週ごとに開かれているようなカンファレンスのスポンサーをしたりとかですね、あとは、ファンディング、午後一のパネルでもちょっと話しましたけれども、Ruby 組織がやろうとしているのはファンディングステージですね、いくつかやってて、プロジェクトに対して、お金を提供して、技術開発するとか、そういうようなことをすでにやっています。で、そういう意味ではですね、コミュニティに関しての組織化について、Ruby セントラルですね、日本よりも随分進んでいるという点があると思います。で、世の当然の違いっていうんですかね、日本人ってそういう草の根っぽいコミュニティ、オープンソースにまつわる草の根っぽいユーザー会とかですね、日本 Ruby のもそうですけども、っていうのはすごい得意で上手なんですけども、お金が絡んだところも含めて上手に回すっていうのはちょっと、少なくとも1キル迷いの方が上手だなというふうに思います。で、あとですね、さっきリッチが言ってましたけれども、私たちは技術は共有してるんですね。Ruby、私たちと同じその Ruby ソースコードを見て、同じ Ruby を作って、で、みんなで一緒にRuby の技術を開発しましょうっていう話をしてますし、メールユースにやり取りもしてるんですけども、じゃあ、個別のユーザーの持っている、例えば、ノウハウだとかいうことに関しての技術移転とかですね、あまり行われていないなというのが正直なことです。で、言葉の壁がかなり厚いので、その辺は課題ではあるんですけれども、私たちは英語のブログを読むことはちょっと頑張ればできるんですけど、逆はほとんど不可能なので、その辺も含めてですね、ちょっと改善していきたいなというのが今後の課題ですね。あと、Ruby カンファレンスとかに参加していて思うのはですね、ビジネス関係に関して彼らは非常に進んでるんですけれども、じゃあテクノロジープレゼンテーションになったときに、結構日本のは進んでるやって思うことがたくさんあるんですね。Ruby 会議とかで技術こんなことやりましたみたいな発表している人たちの方が、大体日本の人は働きやってることが多いんですけど、仕事の合間にうちでコンピューターで自己紹介こんなことやりましたっていう発表の方が技術的にレベルが高かったりするので、それが日本の人に知られないのはちょっともったいないなというふうな気がします。国際交流については今後考えていかないといけないテーマだと思います。
ありがとうございます。ちょっと個人的なことを話させていただきますと、一応私の方は毎年 Ruby カンファレンスの方に参加しておりまして、で、Ruby カンファレンスに行くたびに行ったし、チャドはいなかったことも、インドの方で仕事された時があっていなかったこともあったんですけど、毎年行くと、リツとシャドが会えるという感じなので、日本でこの2人がいるというにすごい感激というか感動しているんですが、で、せっかくちょっと日本に来ていただいたので、この機会にその日本の、Ruby を使っている人、Ruby ストに対して、何かメッセージというか希望というか言いたいことというかあれば、ちょっとお二人に言っていただきたいなと思います。いかがでしょうか。
Well, first I will say that Arkashi-san and friends have always come to the Ruby conference, and as he said, we were always very impressed when they make the trip. It means a lot because that means that he and Matsumoto are like the bridge between the two worlds, between Japan and the European and American Ruby Union. This is the ocean here. We have always been afraid to come to Japan. Not really afraid, but we thought it would be longer and more difficult than it is. And so I think we need to get the message spread throughout the English-speaking world that it's easy to come to Ruby Kaigi. Easy and a very nice experience, and one that will help to bring the communities together. But in terms of just where the community is now, it's interesting because in the US we started so small and so far behind the Japanese community. Because Ruby was always big in Japan and no one knew about it in the United States. And now it's sort of turned around, which is surprising and interesting. And of course Rails is largely responsible for that. But also it is the passion of the developers in the community and the passion of the members who create small organizations. So it grows and it starts from user groups, but thinking big and growing from there will make a lot of things happen. And I think the regional conferences in the United States are a good example of that, where Ruby Central started a grant program where we would give some small amount of money to help people in regional areas create small conferences. And when we created the program, we expected maybe 20 or 30 people at each conference. And now there are many conferences throughout the country, always running, all helping each other. And they're getting big. They're sometimes 200 people. And now they're happening in Europe as well. And that's a sign that the community, as it gets very big and starts to explode, is helping the smaller pockets of the community fill gaps and helping each other grow at the same time. I think that's important to how successful Ruby has become in the English-speaking world.
It's more of a network now of conferences rather than just big ones. Like even in the Java community, you didn't see that. It was so corporate oriented that there was one major Java conference really, you know, and in California, and that was kind of it. Java 1, that was the big one. And then there were user groups. And our user group in Northern Virginia can have 50, 60 people a month come to it. And then in Washington, D.C., it's 20 miles away, it's the same. 50, 60 people a month go to that. We're going to have our first regional conference. We weren't involved with it, but a regional conference in Washington, D.C. Of 150 people. It's going to happen in early August. And then there's others that are going around, and so this network of conferences actually helps the community scale better.
すみません、ちょっと話が盛り上がっているところですが、そろそろお時間なので、質疑応答ということで、どなたか会長の方で質問のある方はいらっしゃいますでしょうか。はい、どうぞ。質問ある方、そちらの方、質問は日本語でしていただければ助かるんですが、どなたかあれば。いらっしゃらないでしょうか。じゃあ、こちら。
実行委員の角谷と言います。私はずっとレイズカンフに行きたいと思っていて、去年初めて行ってすごく感動したんですけども、今回で自分が運営に関わっている理解にジャズのどっちが来ているので、これはまた感激しているんですけども、例えばですね、その Ruby カンフを日本でやるとかはどうすかねみたいなところを聞きたい。
I think it's a wonderful idea.
Thank you.
Seriously, we will talk about it. We need to talk to David Black also, and to the organizers of Ruby Kaigi. But we made some small talk in Charlotte last year, and I think now that we have come here, we see that it's possible and good idea. Yeah.
ということは熱いです。
ありがとうございます。
ありがとうございます。なんか他に質問のある方は欲しいですかね。はい、では、じゃあ、そうですね、お二人、Rubyセントラルとインさん、今後の活動について何かあれば教えていただけますでしょうか。
Ruby Central is starting to collect money. And the money is coming from the conferences, from RailsConf especially. It's a lot of money. And we also understand that companies in the United States are willing to donate money to important causes for Ruby. So our plan is to use that money to help the Ruby community, because we are a nonprofit. So I think Matsumoto-san has mentioned that we are going to be funding long-term projects, and by long-term I mean 3 to 4 month maximum, but full-time projects for people in the Ruby community to work on important projects for Ruby. Maybe Ruby core features, maybe important libraries, maybe even documentation. And those would be funded at very favorable salary rates. So this is our biggest plan for the Ruby Central.
And for InfoEther, although right now we're supporting ourselves through consulting in the Ruby and the Rails space, we are building our own product as well. And so our goal is to have that product come out towards the end of this year. And it's actually a Ruby desktop product. And we need to get Matt's a Macintosh so we can use it. But we'll do that. But so that's actually what our company is doing, is we're building Ruby-based products.
以上、2人、チャント・パウランと、リッチ・キルマンの2人に、お話しいただきました。最後に、2人に盛大な特集をよろしくお願いします。どうもありがとうございました。以上をもちまして、海外コミュニティ編を、終了いたします。で、引き続き、国内のコミュニティの方に関しての、ご紹介の方に移らせていただきますので、
もらっちゃっていいですか。当日スタッフの人で今手が空いている人は、ちょっと全員そっちの、今関さんが座っているところに集まってもらえると助かるので、ご協力よろしくお願いします。
国内コミュニティの方、前の方に来ていただけますでしょうか。よろしくお願いします。
全部使ってます。はい。